I'm Bill. Lois and I often walk on the back roads and trails near our house here at Bedford Hills. Today, though, she's gardening. We believe that this sort of consistent exercise has kept us in the good health that we still enjoy. We have seen a great deal of AA history in the making since we moved here in 1941, something that it is most wonderful to remember.
I'm Lois. Bill and I are so grateful that we have been able to live and work together here in the country. Bill has a studio on our hill where he writes. I work in the garden and carry on with Al-Anon at my desk upstairs. Welcome to Stepping Stones, dear friends.
Well, I think perhaps the best place to start this narrative would be on a summer night in 1934 at Towns Hospital, that famous drying out emporium in New York where I had so often been. On this occasion, I was there next to my last time, and the news was all bad. I knew that you were talking to the doctor downstairs, dear old Dr. Silkworth, who has become enshrined in our hearts in all the years since as nothing less than a medical saint.
I never will forget his telling me that you were absolutely hopeless, that he'd once thought that there was hope. But now he was afraid I would have to commit you, or you would die of alcoholism, or go insane.
He had intimated that to me before, as you well know, that this could be the end of the line. But up until this point, I had had some hope myself. As you remember, he had described alcoholism to us as a sort of terrible compulsion to drink against one's will, against one's happiness, and against one's best interest. A compulsion not too often overcome by an individual on his own resources. Attached to this, he thought there was a physical condition, an allergy, so that if the drinking persisted, it eventually meant insanity or death. And meanwhile, great desolation indeed, which had been our lot. I well remember leaving the hospital after this fatal sentence had been passed upon me, and indeed upon you. This time, I had a fear of alcohol that I had never known it in such an intensity before. And I suppose it was mainly fear and constant vigilance that kept me sober for the next few months. I remember how you made every effort, how we went on many walks, how we read together, how we exerted every possible resource we could to combat this thing. Then I remember how I began to feel better, how confidence returned, though false confidence it proved to be. Little by little, the horror of the experience of towns lessened, almost disappeared. I even went back over to Wall Street and was able to pick up a few dollars. Perhaps things weren't so hopeless as the doctor had said. Then came that day when you had to work in the department store. It was November 11th, 1934, Armistice Day. And I proposed to go to Staten Island to play some golf all by myself. I, of course, thought that, well, I've certainly got to make it this time. But no, again I was stricken. Again I vaguely remember faces and buses, and then oblivion. And then comes a part of the story that I don't remember, but which you certainly must.
Well, I found you in the areaway, I remember, with a great gash across your face and dragging the golf clubs. You certainly were a sad-looking sight. And I had to take you in and put you to bed.
I guess you even had a lot of trouble getting me upstairs. When I came around this time, I was truly hopeless. For the first time, I could see myself as a denizen of a mental hospital. For perhaps a week, I drank on. And if that were possible, the utter hopelessness of our situation was borne in on me. I seldom left the house except to get gin. I was either on my bed asleep or downstairs in the kitchen, my favorite drinking spot. While there on a bleak afternoon in that month of November, the telephone suddenly rang. I went, and I heard the voice of an old school friend, the one now so well and affectionately known to AA as Ebby. I asked him to come over, sensing, however, that he was in New York sober. I couldn't remember a time when he had paid such a visit. Soon he was at the outer door. I looked through the grating at him, and even in my haze, I had once perceived that something extraordinary had happened. He greeted me very cheerily. I stumbled inside. We sat at the kitchen table. I pushed across to him a pitcher of gin flavored with pineapple juice. And at this point, he shook his head and with a smile said, "Well, I'm not drinking just now." Well, this mystified and also disappointed me. I thought that he and I could retreat into the past. I knew that he had been threatened by commitment to an institution, and the same threat overhung me. So we were companions in misery. But he wasn't miserable at all. I couldn't understand it. Something had happened. So I said to him, Ebby, what's got into you? Why won't you drink and talk about the good old days? Well, he said, I'll put it to you in a few words. I've got religion. Well, that was a terrific blow to me. I just couldn't understand a man like Ebby getting religion. After all, I'd had one of these wonderful scientific trainings that had taught me that man evolved from the ooze, and that was it. So here was my friend, he'd got religion. Well, I knew I had to be polite, so I said, well, Ebby, could you tell me what brand this is? Well, he wouldn't commit himself to saying it was a brand. He told of his association with the Oxford groups and how they emphasized getting honest with one another, with making a survey of their defects, admitting that they were powerless without the help of God. Cliches of that sort, they seemed to be then. And then he told how, when he had become willing to try these simple expedients and to try helping another without any thought of reward, he had been released, as he said, from this awful compulsion to drink. Well, his story made an impression on me. It was bound to, because after all, we were blood brothers under the skin, victims of the same malady. So what he had to say struck me deep. There was nothing new in the principles he advocated, but here he was living proof of their effectiveness. One alcoholic talking to another, forming the first link in the chain that has become Alcoholics Anonymous of today. Well, at this juncture, Lois came home and found us both there. I think she was dismayed at first, but she saw that at least Ebby was sober. So can you remember your reaction as you came down into the kitchen?
I wasn't entirely happy about the whole setup.
Well, my dear, you couldn't be blamed for that. I can't seem to remember what happened then. Ebby took his leave at some point, but in no waking hour in the days that followed could the memory of his face and what he had to say leave me. I kept returning to it again and again. The drinking went on, but not at such a heavy pace. Of course, I was nonplussed that he believed in God. The idea of getting honest with oneself, with other people, with helping others, that would all come easy. But that it was necessary for me to believe in God to achieve recovery from alcoholism, well, this just couldn't be. So, in a way, the first effect of his talk upon me was to deepen my dilemma. Perhaps I was within sight of salvation, but still unable to reach the other shore. And so my thinking went on, and so did the drinking. Until one morning, after Lois had left for the department store, where she was working to support me, I resolved to go back to see Dr. Silkworth at Towns Hospital, ask him to sober me up again, so that I could get a clear view of Ebby and his cure for drinking. I remember on the way buying a lot of beer, drinking most of it, coming into the hospital waving a bottle, shouting at the doctor that this time I had something. Well, this dear old man who really loved me shook his head sadly and said, I guess you have. You'd better get upstairs and go to bed. So to bed I went. This time I was physically still in pretty good shape. The drinking hadn't got on long enough. So, in the matter of 2 or 3 days, I was well off the liquor, but still fearfully depressed, still in the grip of my awful dilemma. How was I to achieve a belief in God, were that required to stop my drinking? I became more and more morose. I just couldn't see how this corner could be got around. At about 11 o'clock in the morning of the 3rd day, my friend Ebby stood in the door. As before, bright and cheerful. I remember being a little suspicious of him. I thought perhaps this time he'd turn on the evangelical heat. But no, he was a prudent man. We chatted about everything excepting drinking. And it finally put me in the position of having to ask him again about those simple principles for recovery. This admitting you were hopeless, well, that wasn't too hard. This getting honest with yourself and another person, well, one could do that. This making restitution for harms done other people. A tough job, but certainly one would try that. Working with others without any demand for money or acclaim. Well, that would be just wonderful. But when he came to the God part, again, I remember a terrible balking and rebellion. He also told me a little bit about his own recovery and what had preceded it. A friend of his, a prominent American businessman, having exhausted all of the cures of note in the United States, had 2 or 3 years earlier taken himself to Europe, where he was put under the care of Dr. Carl Jung. Dr. Jung was one who thought that man was more than $2 worth of chemicals, a bundle of instincts, and a certain amount of intelligence. He thought that man had a soul. Nevertheless, after a whole year's treatment, Hazard again relapsed on leaving the doctor. Returning, he had asked if there was any further hope. He had thought the doctor to be his court of last resort. And Dr. Jung, a great and humble man, said, Roland, my art cannot save you. But there is one other resource. That is a spiritual experience. Something that will transform you, expel this compulsion, and enable you to do what you couldn't do before. So Hazard had brought this message to Ebby. It was much the same kind of a message that I had received from Dr. Silkworth. I was hopeless so far as my own resources were concerned, and this message coming to me through this new channel intensified my depression. Now again, I must make the point that on his second visit, Ebby made no attempt to evangelize me. He just stuck to his own story, and then when this was finished, he took his departure. When he went, I sunk into the most unbearable depression that I had ever known. I suppose that momentarily at least, the last vestige of my prideful obstinacy was crushed out. I was just a child, crying alone, very alone, in the dark. For the extremity of this agony, I can find no words. And then I remember crying out, if there is a God, will he show himself? And then came the miracle, the great central experience of my whole life. The room instantly lit up in a blinding glare of white light. I was seized by an ecstasy such as I had never known. It seemed to me that I then stood on a mountaintop where a great clean wind was blowing. I thought to myself, but this is not air, this is spirit. This is the God of the preacher. How long I remained in this state, I just cannot say. And again, I have no words to describe what it was like. At length, however, I found myself on the bed, but now I was in a new world. A world in which everything was right, despite the wrongs of the world I had been living in. I felt myself filled with the consciousness of the presence of Spirit, of God. A great peace stole over me. And there I laid and reveled in this new and loving consciousness.
Yes.
At length I became truly frightened. I thought I was hallucinating. So I called Dr. Silkworth, told him the story as best I could, and said to him, Doctor, am I hallucinating? Have I gone crazy? He questioned me. And at length, he said, no, Bill, he said, you are not crazy. Some great psychic event has occurred. I can feel it. I can see it, but I can't define it. Whatever it is, it's much better than what had you only an hour ago.
Hold on.
And you'd better hold on to what you have. Well, this was great news to me. The next big piece of news came in the form of a book brought to me by my friend Ebby on his next visit. This book was written by William James and was called Varieties of Religious Experience. Though the experiences were of many kinds, I at once saw that they'd had transformed people, and that nearly all of these experiences in this book had to do with people who had found themselves in an utterly hopeless state. A state of mind or existence where there was no way around, under, or over. Well, this was what had happened to me. And in this book, I found experiences similar to my own. And best of all, the great William James thought that these experiences had objective reality. Following the reading of this book, there came to me a vision of a chain reaction among alcoholics, in which each recovered man would come to the next, hope in one hand and hopelessness in the other, saying in effect, If you are an alcoholic, you have an obsession that condemns you to drink, an allergy that condemns you to die. Your only resource is a spiritual experience. If, then, the doctors were quoted upon the hopelessness of the situation, the God of medicine would in effect say to each newcomer, our resources will not bring you back to life. In short, and paradoxically, the chances of the alcoholic to recover by the spiritual experience means would be just in proportion to his hopelessness. Yes, the secret would be deflation at depth, using the tools given us by science, the compulsion plus the allergy. Then when one alcoholic carried this message to the next, he could reach the newcomer where he lived, even below consciousness. Then bringing about the deflation, he would create a dependence of the newcomer upon his sponsor, upon a group if there were any, and finally upon God. In some such form, the concept of such a possible chain reaction occurred to me. Leaving the hospital shortly afterward, I joined up with the Oxford groups, and along with Ebby and Roland and 2 or 3 other drunks, we began to work with alcoholics. The result was almost nil. In my case, it was absolutely nil, because at that time I was insisting that everybody have a spiritual experience just like mine. I'm afraid that I was preaching, and I was pontificating. I tried dozens of drunks at Towns Hospital, where Silkworth let me talk to them, and scores more we found in a mission connected with Calvary Church, whose rector was Dr. Sam Shoemaker, whose influence was to be so great upon our destiny. But still nothing much happened. Either the drunks would tap their heads and look the other way, or they might stay sober a matter of weeks or months and then flop dismally. So little by little, I discovered that I had converted my wonderful experience into a foolish rationalization by which I myself had begun to play God. At this juncture, I tried to get back into business. And then came an opportunity to engage in a struggle for a control of a small machine tool company in Akron, Ohio. It's getting chilly out here. Lois, you look as cold as you can be.
Well,
why don't we go inside and continue there, and maybe you'd make us a pot of coffee.
Okay, let's go.